20th century was one that was filled with political turmoil between nearly every country in the world. There were multiple armed conflicts, including two world wars, a Great Depression, and horrible political tensions surrounding the Cold War. However, at the center of these conflicts, there were a few main countries that took up the majority of the power, including the US, France, Germany, and Great Britain. At the start of the 20th century, many of the powers in Europe had extremely weak political bonds due to past conflicts. So, with the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian terrorist group, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This could have been a relatively small war if it had stayed here, but each of the two countries involved had very powerful allies, who escalated the war extremely rapidly, so the conflict soon grew into becoming the First World War. World War I was the most important of all the events in the 20th century because it set the stages for both the Great Depression and World War II. It was able to cause change in how every war in the future was done, and it gave rise to many new forms of government policy, including nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. The war started in 1914 and, as stated earlier, involved most European countries, even those that were considered to have little power. The Serbian fanatic group that assassinated the Archduke was called the Black Hand, whose purpose, according to Britannica.com, was to help create a liberated Serbian society. The leaders of this group felt that Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was a threat to this purpose due to the fact that he kept many Serbs and Bosnians in Austria-Hungary. It was because of this that they had him killed, an act that many would soon regret. A short time after Archduke Ferdinand died, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Once war was declared, Russia immediately stated its support for Serbia, while Great Britain and France joined later to create the Triple Entente. However, Germany and the Ottoman Empire held support of Austria-Hungary, forming an alliance known as the Central Powers. Eventually, other countries such as the US, Italy, Belgium, and Bulgaria would join the war as well, which is what made this the first true world war. But other than the assassination, there were many overall factors that contributed to the start of World War I. For example, as it says at kidsconnect.com, if one country declared war on another, the other countries would also have to enter the conflict because it was in the treaty they agreed. These pre-made treaties that were signed in Europe were a major part of why the war was started, because they caused many European countries to have to ally with someone in the war. This was also one of the big reasons why the war escalated as quickly as it did. These treaties were created in the first place to prevent a major war from happening, because the rulers of the countries at the time believed that no one would want to start a conflict between so many powerful allied groups. Another major factor in causing this war was that Austria-Hungary gave Serbia a list called the Ultimatum of things that they had to do in order not to face military attack. Of course, Serbia was not able to meet all of these demands, and so they asked Russia for help, setting into effect all of the following conflicts. As most people know, World War I ended with a victory for the people in the Triple Entente, as well as the other allies, over Germany and Austria-Hungary. But even though the war ended, the costs were extremely higher than any other previous war. According to the website for the Gilder-Lehrman Institute of American History, World War I killed more people, more than 9 million soldiers, sailors, and flyers, and another 5 million civilians, involved more countries, 28, and cost more money, $186 billion in direct costs, and another $151 billion in indirect costs, than any other previous war in history. These numbers were incredibly shocking to the people of the world, who had never seen a war on such a massive scale before. From a more strategic standpoint, World War I was a great jump into the future, with the emergence of tanks, planes, and submarines as effective tools of warfare. The war also saw a great change in wartime communication between troops, as before World War I, many militaries would use things such as carrier pigeons to keep up communication. During the war, however, the use of radio saw a great increase. This fact is shown by a quote from livescience.com that says, "The wireless, as early radio was sometimes called, quickly proved invaluable to wartime efforts. Radio operators with portable transmitters, for instance, were able to warn soldiers of an attack of poisonous gas, giving them time to don their gas masks." However, even though many advancements were made, there were a few countries on the losing side of the war that suffered immensely once it was over. One example of this is how the Treaty of Versailles had been signed by the Allies, taking away much of Germany's former power by limiting their military and industrial might, as well as removing much of the country's former land. The events of World War I had the greatest impact on the people living in the decade, but the war was also able to affect the rest of the century. First of all, World War I directly affected the economies of all the countries involved, and thus contributed to the Great Depression. Once the war was over, Great Britain, France, and Germany all had massive amounts of rebuilding to do, and little money with to do so. So, about 10 years after the war ended, the US decided to loan these European countries money. However, it wasn't long before the US banks started to lose a lot of money themselves, forcing them to shut down and even ask for the money back. This caused many markets to crash and was largely responsible for the Great Depression. But World War I also set up the events that led to the next World War. Political and economic instability in Europe caused many problems, eventually leading to the Nazi takeover of Germany. This fact is shown in a quote from the article Causes of World War II. The economic collapse and political instability caused by World War I led the rise of fascism in Europe to World War II. The Nazi version of fascism was dedicated to the reversal of the Treaty of Versailles and the establishment of a German empire by means of war and conquest. This war and conquest that was led by Hitler is what caused Germany's invasion of France and all of the later events in World War II. Also, the formation of the League of Nations after World War I, which gave many countries hope of peace, was a big failure and led to the future leaders of the world to try and eliminate these mistakes when making the United Nations. So these are just a few reasons how World War I was able to directly lead or influence the events of the rest of the 20th century. All in all, World War I was a huge shock to the people of the world and caused much hardship and turmoil in the rest of the century. From the invention of new tactics and technologies that could be used for war to the destruction of many places in the world, World War I was impactful in many ways. The war was also a prominent event when it comes to shaping the rest of the 20th century. He was directly responsible for most other military conflicts of the century, as well as the Great Depression, that left many countries scrambling for survival. But even through all of this conflict, the war was able to strengthen the US and its allies for all of the coming hardships of the 20th century.